Welcome back to the Other Side podcast. Today I'm joined by the amazing Doris Zagdanski, who was born in Geelong and always dreamed of being a school teacher. She lived that dream until the devastating loss of her daughter Claire due to cot death. Doris found a new calling supporting others through their grief. She is now a celebrated author and speaker and has had an extensive career sharing her wisdom across the country, even training the Queensland Police. I'm sure you'll appreciate Doris's authenticity as well as her practical advice on how to deal with grief and how to support others who are going through their own grief journey. I'm Michael Phoenix. Let's jump into the other side. Welcome back to the Other Side podcast. I'm super excited for today's guest. I've got the lovely Doris Zagdanski sitting here with me today. Doris, thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you for inviting me, Michael.
No problem. So I know you live in the Gold Coast, but you're down in Melbourne. Can you share a little bit about what you're up to down here?
In Melbourne, I'm doing some training with some funeral directors. I'm also running a training session for civil funeral celebrants, and obviously here for your podcast as well. And I was born and raised in Geelong, so I don't need half an excuse to come to Melbourne.
So you're born in Geelong. Can you share a little bit about your younger years and what that was like?
Sure. As I said, born in Geelong, went to school in Geelong. From the time I always say 10 years old, I knew I wanted to be a school teacher. Okay. So I always had that planned. So when I finished high school, I went to Monash Uni and did my degree in Japanese and German, of all things. Wow. And I went back to my old high school as a high school teacher and got married. Had 2 children, basically loved living in Geelong. Was
it teaching your first job or your first career?
Yes, it was. And even now, when I graduated in the 1970s, some people listening in today weren't even born then. But I just did. I had this idea I wanted to be a teacher just forever. And sadly, while I was teaching in Geelong, one of my children died. I had a daughter, Claire, who died of cot death. And I always say, the day that she died, it was the 17th of June, 1980. My life changed forever that day. But in the years that have gone by, and we'll obviously talk about that today, I found myself still involved in educating people and in doing training and so forth. And so I've really spent my life in that space where hopefully I'm teaching people something useful in their life, which is what I wanted to do from the time I was 10.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can certainly attest you absolutely are teaching people some amazing skills and sharing your knowledge. Would you feel comfortable telling me a little bit about Claire?
Oh, absolutely. Where do I start? Maybe I should say, and I often don't say this publicly, but our first child was a daughter, Kate. Yeah. And I was just thrilled to have a little girl. And then when I knew I was, having another child, I thought, I could be really, really lucky and pull this off and have 2 daughters. That's all I ever wanted in my life was 2 daughters. So anyway, when Kate was almost 3, Claire was born. And I really did think I was the luckiest mother in the world. I got my dream, my 2 daughters as such. And I was on maternity leave from teaching. And sadly, when Claire was nearly 10 weeks old, she died of cot death. And I don't know if, people watching this know much about cot death or sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, as it's technically known. But I just put Claire to bed after feeding her. It was sort of around news time in the evening. And she was kind of, I think, a bit unsettled that day, and to be honest, I was a bit annoyed that she wouldn't sleep much that day. And I remember telling a friend of mine, don't know what's wrong today, she's just not settling. But that's what babies do. Anyway, when I was heading off to bed early, I went into her room to check her, and we found that she was dead in her cot. Yeah, and my husband took her out and gave her CPR. I rang an ambulance, and the whole drama just unfolded, from there. It was just the sort of thing you never ever think is going to happen to you. Yeah, we're just so unprepared for, obviously, for a child who's relatively, she was healthy. She was quite a robust, like a chubby little girl, and just normal in every possible way. And she was also the youngest person in the family, and like mum and dad were still alive, and my in-laws, and it was really tough in those early weeks and months to even get it through my head that the youngest person in the family could be the first one to die. Like it made no sense. Yeah. Cot death made no sense. Life and death made no sense. Nothing made any sense. Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that, Doris. I can only imagine that, even after all these years, it's not an easy thing to talk about. So I appreciate your vulnerability there. You mentioned that date that Claire died was the date that your life changed. Now, I'm sure it changed in many ways, but can you talk us through how did your life change after that?
Everything about life had always gone in my favour, and I think it was the first time something didn't, and I learned that I had no control over what happens in life. I think that was a rude shock for me. I learned that I knew nothing about grief. Truly, I had no idea, because I'd never grieved before, and I did everything the wrong way, and we can perhaps talk about that a little bit more too. But I was so unprepared for that. Had to arrange Claire's funeral with my husband, and we had a private funeral, and that was such a mistake, because our friends, we were both teachers, so we both, and taught in big schools in Geelong, and it meant that our colleagues couldn't come to the funeral, and that students wanted to come and couldn't come, and a lot of our friends didn't come because it was private. And I learned afterwards that shutting people out was a terrible thing to do to them. We didn't mean to. I just couldn't cope. I couldn't cope with the numbers. I couldn't cope with the whole business of the funeral. So we just said, people can't come. And so then I had to deal with people being upset by not being allowed to come. And then we had our 3-year-old Kate, who we didn't take to the funeral either. And so for the next, probably 9, 10, 11 more months, we had to try and explain to her what happened to her sister. And we started by making up stories, like we didn't actually say she died. And so then we had to untell stories and retell them. So I had to learn how do you explain death to a 3-year-old as such.
What did you tell her?
Well, we told her, and I can't even believe, Michael, that we said this, but I'm here to be honest. We actually said to her that maybe if I just go back a step, she always called Claire, instead of my sister, she called her my baby. And I thought that was really sweet. So, baby was born, and she would always say, I'll go and check my baby, mummy, and that was really lovely. So the morning after Claire died, Pete, my husband, and I were sitting in the kitchen just shell-shocked, and Kate was still asleep, and let's say it was 7 a.m. by now, and she got up, and we talked about how were we going to tell her. And we're still sort of doing we don't know what the words are, we don't know what to say. And she'd gotten out of bed, and she came into the kitchen, and, I don't know what she said. And then she said, oh, I forgot to check my baby. And before we could say, no, don't go, like into her room because she's not there, she sort of ran off to the nursery and came back and said, my baby's gone. And so then we had to sit her down, and I could cut my tongue out now, but we said, we've got something to tell you, and your baby got sick in the night and an ambulance had to come, which is what did happen, and they took her away to the hospital. That's what we said. We didn't say she died. We didn't say anything. And when she was nearly 3, and she just said, oh, and that was sort of it for the moment, because we'd answered the question, where's my baby? But of course then on a daily basis, we got questions like, when can we visit her? Because she knew what visiting a hospital was like, because she visited me in the hospital when, I had Claire. And so we'd drive past the hospital sometimes when we were shopping as the weeks and months went by, and she'd say, can we visit her? Well, why hasn't the doctor made her better yet? And it got out of hand because we wouldn't answer her straight. And as I said, she didn't go to the funeral, so there was no talking about remember when we said goodbye to Claire, and we just skipped that whole bit about her being dead. And what I learned was that we had to undo all of that information and go back to the start and actually say your sister died. And that was way harder down the track than it was if we'd done it at the start. And so when you ask about how did life change, I think I was just on this big learning curve of, I thought I knew everything because, I'd been to university and I learned I knew nothing. I knew nothing about life, nothing about loss, nothing about grief, nothing about how to talk to a little one who's grieving. I just didn't know anything about sustaining the tough times in life. And I had to change my thinking, I had to change my behaviour, and we changed as people, I became just a very sad person. I was a very angry person. I was really angry that the world had let us down, I was angry. I was angry that all I ever wanted was 2 little girls without asking too much, and then one of them was taken away, and why? I think the question why just didn't ever have an answer that made any sense to me. And I just saw life was unfair, and I saw people that I thought, why did it happen to me? Like it should have happened to someone. You'd read an article in the paper about someone who, I don't know, was a drink driver, and I thought, well, why didn't you die? Why was it my daughter? She never harmed anybody. But that was one of the big learnings, that life isn't fair. And I learned probably one of the rudest lessons ever, that bad things happen to good people. They really do. And that was something I had to learn to manage in my grief. That I just had to learn that bad things happen to good people, whether I liked it or not. Yeah.
Doris, I was just thinking, now you're a renowned author and have helped so many people deal with grieving the loss of their own loved ones, but back at that time, what sort of resources were there available?
Yeah, look, and I think that was the difficulty for us. I think it began even when we arranged Claire's funeral. We had a lovely gentleman who was the funeral director, but we're talking 1980s, and he didn't know anything about grief and grieving parents or anything like that, and I don't think he was of any use to us to even help us there as a resource. I remember asking him about taking Kate to the funeral. I said, look, she's going to be 3 in a few weeks. Is she too young? We just don't know what to do. And he said, oh, she's a bit young for that. He said, she might be better off at home. Wrong answer, I know now, but because we knew nothing, we thought, oh, well, he's the expert, we'll take his advice. So, we weren't supported there. I found even within my family, the support was not what I needed at the time, but we were all in grief, we were all in shock. My parents wanted me just not to cry, and Mum would always say to me, you're not going to cry again today, are you? And so, you try and obey your mum, and do the not crying when on the inside you're just broken to a million pieces. And I found that not helpful, but they didn't know either. So I think the family support was, wasn't what we needed, but if the shoe were on the other foot and it was somebody else in my family, I wouldn't have been any better at supporting them, because you didn't talk about grief, you didn't talk about death in that time. You probably still don't today all that much in families, but we were so unprepared and we just didn't have the knowledge to help ourselves. But as the months went by, through a friend, I met another mum who'd had a little boy who died soon after birth, and she belonged to a bereaved parents support group that was actually based in Melbourne. And so I went along to some of those gatherings, and I found that really helpful, talking to other parents. And for me, it didn't matter if it was a cot death or a stillbirth or a sick child. It was someone who'd been through a similar experience, and they just made sense. You didn't have to explain yourself. You didn't have to apologise for crying. They all thought life was unfair. They were all angry with the world too. And so I didn't feel weird or like there was something wrong with me. So I found that was helpful. And then after, and I don't know the timeline, but I'm going to say maybe 2 or 3 years, I became involved in a fairly newly formed Sudden Infant Death Research Foundation, which was based in Melbourne. And I started to go to some of their meetings, and I actually I did some training in how to be a support person to a family, and I started to visit families where there was a cot death in Geelong at the request of the coroner in Geelong. They wanted to have a family deliver a letter rather than a family receive it in the mail saying that the autopsy had been completed and the child had died of sudden infant death syndrome, and this is what it meant, and this was the sort of support you could reach out to. And I was one of those other mums they could talk to. I'd visit with them, and so I got involved with doing that as well, but it was all a little bit casual. And it probably, now that I think about it, the support came from strangers, not so much from family. And I had a few friends who were just there, whether I was good, bad or ugly, they were there. But I think by and large, people really struggled with us. They just didn't know what to say. And I get that now. I didn't then, but I get it now.
I'm interested in this thing that you mentioned about the coroner. So tell me if I've got this right. So you were sort of working alongside the coroners in Geelong insofar as, so if a family had lost a baby to cot death, you would personally go and visit them.
Yes.
And what was that like? What were those visits? What did they involve?
Well, usually we would go several weeks after the death because they had to do all their paperwork and so forth. But the ambulance service in Geelong and the police had our phone number, and they could ring us on the day of a cot death if the family wanted to see someone, and they would say, we've got, and my husband did these visits with me sometimes, we have a couple who have also been through this, who they're not professionals, they're just volunteers. But if you'd like to talk to someone who's been through something like what you're going through, we have their phone number. And the police would ring us, the ambulance would ring us and say there's a family in whatever part of Geelong who'd like you to visit. And so I must admit, it was pretty tough, but I knew that these people, when they said they wanted to see someone, I got why they did, because I remember when it happened to us, it was like, I just wanted to say to someone, how does this happen? And like, how could it happen to me? And what does it mean? And, you search yourself for I remember I went through every minute of the day on the day she died. What could I have done wrong that day? Was there something that I didn't notice? It was just like, this couldn't happen for no reason. That is not possible that something like this could just happen, but it did. And so when we were visiting families, I hoped we kind of brought this sort of a scenario that said, these people have been through a similar thing and they've survived it. Because I think we represented survival. Yeah. And I remember one mum, if I can say, she said to me years afterwards, I visited her, and she said her doctor had organised my visit, and he said, I think it would be good for you to meet another mum. She's a local lady in Geelong and she volunteers and she's been through this, and I can contact her. It'd be good for you to sit and talk to her, because it was several months after her son had died. And he said, I think she'd be able to just help you with some of your questions and all of this. So anyway, he rings me, we set up the meeting, and she said to me, I was expecting someone to come to my front door who was broken, dishevelled, could hardly put two words together, was a mess, and that's what I was expecting to be at my front door, because that's how I felt. And she said, you knocked at the door and I opened it, and she said, there you were with a pretty floral dress on and lipstick. And she said, you don't know this, but that day you represented survival to me. I thought, oh my goodness, if that lady can look like that and she's been through this, maybe I'll survive too. And I think, I didn't even know that's what we symbolised. Yeah. And the way she said you had lipstick on, because I know after Claire died, I didn't care if my hair was combed, if I had lipstick on, if I'd had a shower. I could have stayed in my dressing gown all day and that would have been ample for me. I just had I can't be bothered with life, can't be bothered with the world going on. I know that's normal.
Yeah, isn't it amazing that just it's that simple act of wearing a dress and putting lipstick on and what that represents?
Yes, yeah, totally. Yeah.
So, and what do you say when, let's pretend I'm a recently bereaved father and I'm looking at you, you've just come to visit me, I've lost my baby, and I'm saying, Doris, it just is not fair. Yeah. This is just not right. How do you respond to those sorts of things?
I would respond by acknowledging that thinking, and I'd say, yes, Michael, you're right, it's not fair, is it? It just shouldn't happen. And not knowing why it's happened is part of the trauma, part of what makes it not fair. So I wouldn't ever say kind of about the space I'm in now, like I think it's not fair, but it doesn't bother me like it used to, because I accept now that unfair things happen to people, and it's okay. I'm not any more special than anyone else, so it was my turn for unfairness, and I accept that. But if you had have said that to me all those years ago, I would probably have slapped you or something, because what grieving people don't want, they don't want my logic right now. They don't want my wisdom. I've got 46 years now of thinking about this event. For these people who are fresh in their grief, they haven't even begun to start thinking about it. So they just need acknowledgement that whatever they're thinking, feeling, doing is part of survival today. That's the best they can do today. Just try and survive the day.
What are some of the worst things that you could say to a grieving person, or what are some of the worst things that you heard after Claire died?
Look, Michael, this is something I've learned, and I often say this to, if I speak to a bereavement, like a support group or someone, I say one of the things you're going to learn, if you haven't learned it already, is people will say stupid things. Like, that's a lesson about grief. And we seriously did. Like, we had everybody offering their theories of cot death and bizarre things. We had people who would say things like, I read in the Woman's Weekly, blah, 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 as if you'd go there for your grief counselling and grief support. We had people who would tell us, I call them war stories, of other people that they knew that had a death, you know, and it's like, that family's war story doesn't help me with my story at all. We had, and what I often call the people that, you know, want to make it right, the people who want to kind of lessen the pain, and so they say, well, you know, I know it's hard, but, you know, you've got a special little angel in heaven now. And, you know, I didn't want a special little angel in heaven. I wanted my daughter on earth with me where she belonged. Yeah. And I know now they were trying their hardest, but when you're talking to someone who's grieving, your job isn't to look for a compensation. You know, people saying, you know, this is going to make you stronger. And I didn't want to be stronger. I just want to be good old me that I used to be. I remember someone saying, maybe you weren't supposed to have 2 children. Maybe Kate's just going to be an only child. Well, that didn't help me. And it's this thinking out loud that I found people needed to keep those thoughts to themselves. They didn't help. But what I've also learned is that grieving people are not very good at assertively saying to a friend, I know you're trying hard to say something comforting, but when you tell me I've got a little angel in heaven, it doesn't comfort me. I want my angel here with me. And so I never said that. So you'd keep getting it and getting it and getting it. And that's what I found really difficult. Just the people who wanted to kind of make it right when it's not right. And they should have just said that. And I would have felt better. Yeah.
Something that I'm sure some people will notice that are watching this is that you don't use language like Claire passed away or anything that. You talk about that she died. Tell us why that's important to use that sort of language.
Right from the word go, and I don't know why, but I always said my daughter died. I never said passed away. It isn't language that I like, but I didn't even like it before I knew I was going to have to use the word dead and die. I think I'm just such a believer in reality. Like, people these days, I hear, say the word pass a lot. They don't even say pass away now. It's just, you know, when grandma passed. And I'm thinking, it just isn't real. It just isn't true. I think in terms of children, like, children need honesty. Children need to understand what we mean, not what we hope they'll understand. So dead and died for me, they're just not offensive words. They are the truth. I also, in my training and education programs, often use the example of he's an American fellow called Bill Warden, J. William Warden. He writes his books under, and he writes about grief, coping with grief, and so on and so forth. And he has a model called the 4 tasks of mourning, which talk about how you can help yourself get through your grief, almost, you know, like a little bit of, here are some ways you can help yourself. He's not talking stages of grief or anything like that. He's just saying this is the sort of stuff that you're going to have to do to get through this. And task 1 is accept the reality of what has happened. And you don't accept the reality, I believe, if you cannot say dead and died. That's the reality. People aren't passing, they're dying. And so I just always do that. And I've always said it, I've never changed my language according to who I speak to, because I'm just not ashamed. I don't think it's a bad word. We might not like the reality, but it is a reality. Yeah.
What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about grief?
Oh, number one, I can tell you, I don't even have to think about it, Michael. Number one is that time will heal. And we say it to people, we sort of pat them on the shoulder and say, it's the early days, time will heal, you'll get over it, time will heal. Time does nothing but move on. One day becomes 1 week, becomes 1 month, becomes 1 year. If I do nothing with my grief, if I sweep it under the carpet, if I say to myself, I'm going to never ever acknowledge that this person has died, I'm never going to say their name again, I'm going to put their photos away and not be reminded, whatever I do to not grieve, all it will do is this. It will just sit inside me where it just sits. And I always say this, your grief will come and find you when it's ready. And often it'll find you maybe when someone else dies or when someone you might go to a funeral to support a colleague or something, and you're sitting there in the funeral and suddenly you're crying about your own dad who died, but you were brave and tough and strong and didn't do your grieving. So time just marches on. What you do with your time is what's important, and what you need to do with your time is learn how you're going to manage your changed life. How are you going to, in my case, how am I going to learn to manage with only having one child when I used to have two? And so I have to learn to answer questions by people who say, so how many kids have you got? And you've got to go, oh, do I say one, or do I talk about the one who's died, or do I just not even go there? Learning how to manage that is something that time allows me to do. At first I might not be good at it. I might say it, I might not say it, and then I get to a point where I know how I'm going to deal with it. Time allows you to manage Christmases without them, birthdays without them, special family days without them, and so forth. You don't learn that in a week or two, or a month or two, or a year or two. So it's a big answer, Michael, but time will not heal your grief. It's what you do to learn to manage your changed life. That's what is a truth. Yeah. So that to me is probably number one. Number two, I think, is we still think it's important for people to be strong. And we say you must stay positive, you must be strong, you have to be strong in front of the children or whatever. And I say to people, no, just be you. If you're having a bad day, just say, hey, today's not a good day. I've been crying since I got up this morning. Just like own the grief without shame. You don't have to explain yourself. Just be real rather than be someone who pretends they're okay when they're not. And I think if you're helping a friend, don't encourage them to be strong, because you're really saying, when you're with me, I don't want to see anything like your grief. And it's usually more about me, because I'm awkward about it, I don't know what to do. So I think that's an issue. And maybe the third one, I could come up with plenty more, but that people don't say the name of the person who's died, and it really upsets the grieving person. Like I have in one of my books, I have a widow who says, my husband only died, he never existed. And how painful it is when people won't say their name, or if they say it, they go, oh, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned that. Like you don't want them to be part of your life anymore. And I found again, after Claire died, people would so avoid any mention of her, and that hurt me all over again, because we were trying to learn to live with the fact that she'd lived and died, and they were trying to act like she never existed, and that is just hurtful. And I have a quote in one of my training programs that comes from a dad who says, when you don't say my son's name who died, my son dies twice. And I always remember that, and I think, yeah, I don't want to be responsible for your son dying twice, because I'm too unsure of how you might react if I talk about him. And it was a big learning lesson from me being with grieving people, especially in those early years as a volunteer, where they loved it that I would talk about their child and use their name. And they'd often say, you know, you're the only one who lets me talk like this. You're the only one who says, have you got some photos that you might want to show me? Because they wanted to show their photos, but nobody else wanted to go there as such. And I learned that people didn't want to shut them out as if they didn't exist. That was more hurtful. Yeah.
Well, I have to thank you, Doris, because at this point you've reminded me that when I first heard one of your talks, which would have been in my early days as a funeral arranger, I'm going to butcher the quote, but it was something to the effect of, if you ask about the person's loved one and it makes them cry, they're not crying because you've asked, they're crying because their loved one's died. And so, again, you would have said it much more eloquently than that, but what I took from that was, don't be afraid to ask about their loved one. In fact, it encouraged me to do so, and it completely changed the interactions that I was having with families. Because as you say, they want nothing more than, or not everyone, but a lot of people welcome the opportunity to show you photos and talk about their loved one. So I thank you for that, because it was a game changer for me.
You didn't butcher the quote. I think you've said it really well. But it's such a simple gesture. But this is something I learned, that once the funeral is over, people just become really awkward about how to approach you. And part of the awkwardness is how to just have a natural conversation. And so you come along and you say the name of the person who's died, or you say, you know, is it okay if I ask to see some photos? Or, you know, I know I'd be in someone's house and there might be a family photo on the wall, and I'd say, so is that your son there? Even if I got it wrong, it didn't matter. But they knew I asked, they knew I cared enough to talk about him. And it's one of my biggest learning lessons, not to shy away from letting them have that conversation. And if they don't want to talk, they'll let you know. And that's okay. Just that I didn't find too many of those people in all the years I've been involved with grieving people.
And I like how you just said before as well, you might lead into it by saying, is it okay if I ask? That's a nice softener as well.
I use that a lot. You know, I might even say, you know, if someone's had a death in their family and, you know, I know them, I'll just perhaps say, look, you know, is it okay if I ask how you're doing? You know, I haven't seen you since your dad's funeral. Is it okay if I ask how the family's going at the moment? Just like that, because it kind of gives them an out. They can say, look, I appreciate you asking, but today's not a good day, or whatever. But this is a truth, Michael. I rarely had someone who said, no, it's not okay, mind your own business. Like, I just can't even recall anyone that said that, because if you ask in the right way, give them permission to say, no, not today, thanks, or just be yourself, be authentic. People can sense that, and then they know they can be authentic. And they know they don't have to be brave and tough and strong. They can just tell me the lay of the land. And I'm not going to feel badly if they cry or they get angry or they're bitter or whatever, because that's what grief does to you.
Yeah. Doris, I do want to talk for a moment about the importance of funerals, because I know that's something you're passionate about. And you mentioned earlier that you chose to have a private funeral for Claire, and maybe in hindsight, that might not have been the best way to go. Why do funerals matter?
Yeah, look, and I guess, you know, I had to learn that. Funerals matter for a number of reasons. I think number one is certainly that it's very difficult for people to cope with their grief if you're here today and like gone tomorrow, and there's no transition, which is what the funeral is. You know, a person dies, we have the funeral, and then we have to learn to live without them. And the funeral kind of sets that up, that time for goodbye. Even if it's sad, even if it's tragic, even if it's funny, and we've got funny stories to tell, to me, the funeral says that we need to say our goodbyes. I think as human beings, we're not good at just having someone in our life and then they disappear. I think of my daughter, who she had her sister and then she just disappeared and never saw her again. And there was no, for us as parents, we couldn't even go back and say, remember, we had a funeral for Claire where we went to say goodbye and we were very sad, but that's what we do when someone dies. So I think it's a transition for us from life to living without them. That's one thing. I think another part of why funerals matter is that for people who know you, it's sort of the place where you make your approach. Like, let's put our cards on the table. Most people don't like funerals. They don't know what to say. They don't know if you say, I'm sorry for your loss, or what do you do? And they hate wanting to go up to the immediate family and give their condolences. But it's the place. And once I've done that, I feel like I've done what's right. You know, I've paid my respects, not just to the person who's died, but to the family as well. If you take that away, people often don't know, when do you approach them? Do I ring them next week, or do I let them be, or do they not want anyone to contact them? And it's often kind of awkward for when do you say something about what's happened. So I think, you know, it matters for that reason. But it also matters for the person who's died, even though I'm a great believer that the funeral is for those who are left behind more than the person who has died. But I've been involved in so many amazing funerals over the years that I've often come away thinking, if only the person who died could have heard this today, they would have loved it. And I think it is an opportunity where we can say what they meant to us, where we can honour them, where we can actually publicly put their life out there and say, I know we've only got an hour, but we're going to do our darndest to really give Dad the tribute he deserves. I think there's something just good for your soul in that, especially when it's done well.
Now, Doris, you and I both know well that there is certainly a trend towards families choosing not to have a service. Why do you think that is?
I think you're right about it being a trend, and I see that continuing because once you start that in a family, I think it becomes the family's way. You know, if Grandma didn't have a funeral and then Granddad dies, I'll go, we'll just do what we did for Grandma. And then Auntie Jean dies and we go, we'll just do what we did for Grandma and Grandpa for Auntie Jean, and that's how we end up doing it. I think some of it, and let's, you know, be honest, some of it is about price. People just say, I just can't afford a funeral. I think some of it is people wanting to escape the emotion of the grief. I don't want to sit there for half an hour or an hour, however we've got. I don't want to be sad. I want to remember the person the way they were. I just don't think that's facing reality. Like, we have to expect there'll be sadness if someone we're fond of dies. It's just part and parcel of our human nature and our humanness. And I know the sadness will not be there for the rest of my life. I know for most people, they learn to manage sadness as such. But I think with some people, it's kind of just avoiding facing the death. And people will say, as you know, Michael, I just want to remember them, you know, as the happy-go-lucky person they were. Well, I want to remember that too, but I also want to honour what they meant to me. And a funeral is our way to do that publicly. And I think one more thing that I've learnt over the years, for some people, they've not been to a funeral that has actually connected with them. You know, they might have sat there through the most boring ceremony ever, or it might have been a religious service for a family that's no longer religious. And they think, well, when I die, I don't want that. Or if my mum dies, we're not giving her that. Because they don't know how creative farewells can be these days. And as I said to you before, I've done some amazing farewells where I've just walked away and thought, like, I've come away almost on top of the world thinking, wow, and the family loved it. You know, and the person who died would have thought, that was amazing what you've done to honour me. And that's what a funeral should be. It shouldn't be something that we grit our teeth through and think at the end of it, well, I'd never want to go to one of those again.
Doris, I would love to hear a little bit about, I mean, obviously today, as I said, you're an author, you're a speaker, you're helping so many people, and you're passing on your wisdom. But where we got up to in your journey was you were a teacher, Claire had died. Can you walk us through after that? How did you find yourself, you know, to the point you're at today?
I missed that part of the story. I'll tell you the truth, the way it happened. After Claire died and the funeral and whatever, as the months went by, I spent a lot of time pondering the whole event, especially the funeral. And I thought to myself, that was a really unhelpful funeral. And I felt there were things that happened that were just not what for example, we weren't asked to select music for the funeral. And I was 26 when Claire died, my husband was 29, and we used to watch Rage every Saturday morning, and we had the biggest record collection, and he used to surf down the beach every Saturday with his mates, and so we were just a young, kind of trendy family. And when we got to her funeral, I so remember walking into the chapel and there's an organist playing this dreary, deathly organ music. And it didn't dawn on me just then, but as the weeks went by, I thought, we didn't even give her any decent music, like our music from home, you know. And I just thought, how did that happen? But we weren't asked. It was, we'll just organise an organist, because that's what you did in the 1980s. So there were things like that, but the thing that probably most broke my heart about her funeral was that I had asked the funeral director at the viewing the night before if we could nurse her one more time. And he said no. He said, we don't do that. Like, once the person is in their coffin, they stay that way. We don't take them out. And so I just did and just let it go. And hated myself forever, thinking afterwards, not then, I just did as I was told, but afterwards I thought, why did I let him say that? Like, she was my baby, not his. Why didn't I just say, I want to hold her one more time? And of course, when you're grieving, you're not very assertive, and I certainly wasn't, but I really beat myself up about that. So fast forward now a few years, like I'm going to say 3 or 4 years, and I met a funeral director by chance through this coroner's home visiting program. And I said to him, I said, you know, I don't think funeral directors really know anything about grief, and I don't think they know what people want when a child has died. And he said, why do you say that? And so I gave him both barrels and I told him, and he just said, oh my God. And I had a lot of things on my list. And he said, that's just amazing, like your observations. And he said, I happen to be organising a conference for funeral directors later in the year. How would you feel if you came as a guest speaker and shared your story about it and your ideas and what you've told me today? And of course, I had said, well, I think I could do that because I was a teacher, so I knew how to stand in front of an audience. So I did. I went to the conference. I had prepared like there's no tomorrow, had all my stuff all logically written down. And I got introduced by this man to the audience, who are all funeral directors, and I got up to the podium to speak where my notes were, and I opened my mouth, Michael, and I just started to cry. And I wanted to start, my opening line was this: on June the 17th, 1980, my second daughter, Claire, died of cot death. that was going to be my opening line. And I couldn't get it out of my mouth, and I had like tears coming down my face. And then I'm thinking, I had like 90 minutes for my session because it was a little bit like workshoppy. And I thought, how am I going to do this for 90 minutes? So I got through my staff, and I talked and I cried and I talked and I cried and I talked and I cried. And they in the audience listened and cried and listened and cried and listened and cried. And at the end of my session, I just lost count the number of funeral directors that came up to me and said, oh my God, you've opened our eyes. Like, we've got to change what we do. We don't let parents hold their babies. We tell them what sort of funeral they're going to have. We assume their grief is too great, so we don't offer them options. We just think, let's make this as simple as we can to save them grief, but we're actually not. And so anyway, that led to me being invited by a funeral company in Geelong to come and work for them in a community education role. But then I found myself arranging funerals, and that was the mid-1980s. And I just have stayed there almost ever since in that educational role with the Australian Funeral Directors Association, as they were known then, and the New Zealand Funeral Directors Association, both of them asking me to be a regular trainer and guest speaker for their members. And that really started my speaking career.
So were you doing that at the same time as arranging funerals?
I was, and the way I got to arrange a funeral was never why I went to this funeral company, because it was the mid-1980s, family-owned funeral companies. The family members arranged the funerals, I was the only woman that worked there. There was no white lady funerals invented even then. And so my job was not to meet with families, but it was the early months of being there. A pastor from a local church rang the funeral company and said, we had a lady that came to our church recently as a guest speaker, and that was me. And he said, we need her to come and speak to one of the families in our church. There's one of the parishioners, I guess you'd call them, was having a baby, and the baby had a congenital abnormality and was going to die when the baby was born. And he said, we'd like the lady to come and speak to this mother about a funeral. And he spoke to my boss. And so my boss came to me and he said, we've had a request for you to visit a family. I know it's not what you do, but they want you to organise the funeral. And of course I hadn't been trained or anything. And I said, well, what do I have to do? And he said, you're going to go to the hospital, the maternity hospital. She's going to be induced tomorrow, like on the weekend. Just talk her through what she needs to do. And I had a rough idea. And he gave me a form which they filled out, which we would now call your arrangement paperwork. And he said, ask every question on both sides of this form and you will have the funeral arranged. So I took my form, went to the hospital, sat on the bed with the mum, just like one mum talking to another mum, and we just talked. And didn't take my paperwork out of my handbag. We just sat. I just couldn't ask her questions. We just talked about the baby, and we talked about naming the baby and maybe what a funeral could look like. I actually said, you'll have an opportunity to choose some music if you've got something that you think you would like. And we talked about all of that. I didn't get any information on my piece of paper, and I went back to work with nothing other than a conversation. And the little baby was born that weekend and died, and I went back to the hospital then and arranged the funeral. But that was my first funeral. And then when I went back and was speaking to the mum and the dad, I said, shall I ring the pastor who rang our funeral home from the church that I'd been a guest speaker at? And they said, oh, no, aren't you doing the funeral? And I said, oh, that's not how it really works. We organise the funeral, but we had, and this was early days of celebrants. We, usually have a priest or a pastor or someone like that. And they just came straight out and they said, no, it's you. You have to do it because we know you now. And they actually said, we don't go to his church, it's my mum's church. We want you. Like, you've been with us now for 2 days, basically. And so that was my first funeral that I ever wrote and did as a celebrant. And then there was no looking back for me. I really felt, of all the things I've done as a funeral director, I like arranging funerals, but I probably like being a celebrant maybe a tiny bit more, because I can then really work with the family, really get to know them and tell the story for them. That's what I love.
How long were you arranging funerals for altogether?
I worked for about 4 years with that funeral company, and then we moved to Queensland. So had to give up my job, moved to Queensland, but within 3 months of being in Queensland, I had got a job with a funeral company as their training manager. That was the group that was then called Service Corporation International, an American-based firm, and I got kind of headhunted and was national training manager for their group, and I worked out of a funeral home. So I would still do a little bit of funeral arranging work and celebrant work. If there was a family that couldn't afford to pay for a funeral, I would do the celebrant service for free, and that would save them a few $100s. And if we were short-staffed, I'd arrange funerals. So because I worked in a funeral home, it was just sort of logical that I'd help out with funerals,
And when did you start writing books?
I actually started in Geelong, and it was at a time when I was working as a funeral director. One of the local schools rang me to ask if I could visit, because a student sadly had been killed the night before going home from school, hit on her bike by a car, and her classmates, it was an all-girls school, were just devastated, as were, the teachers, everyone was. And they asked if I could come and sit with the classmates and just answer any questions, comfort them, do whatever, which I thought was a bit of a tall order, just by the way. But I went, and I did sit with her classmates, and especially her closest friends. And we just talked about, life being unfair and how they're saying, but we can't believe she's not going to be here tomorrow, and one of them was her neighbour, and she said to me, we used to we're really naughty. She said at night when our parents thought we were asleep, we'd climb out our bedroom windows and go into each other's bedroom and hang out till midnight, this sort of thing, and she's not going to be there to hang out with anymore. And I spent that first day, I spent a long time at the school, and I came away thinking, there was nothing for them. There were no books on grief. There was no internet invented. The teachers had no clue. The parents were at a loss. The kids didn't know how they were going to manage their grief. I was struggling. The best I could do was bring me and maybe some common sense, and that was about all. And so I thought, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book for these kids on grief. So I went back to the school a few more times. I said I could come whenever they felt it was appropriate. So I did. I approached them about having permission to interview kids now for my book, for content. Got permission from parents and the school. Spent about a year talking to grieving kids. Wherever I went, I would just talk to grieving kids. Wrote the book. Fortunately, got picked up by a Melbourne publisher who just loved it. And it was all about timing, Michael. There was nothing around. There was just nothing in this genre, but next to nothing about grief. And if there was, it was always American. There was nothing Australian at all. And so I think I was the right person at the right time with the right book. And that really promoted me as a person. I was shocked how many guest speaker requests I got, conference speaking requests, just how many books were sold. Schools bought them, libraries bought them, parents bought them, people bought them. Funeral industry, great supporters, they bought them. And my writing career just took off.
Yeah.
Yes.
How many books have you published?
7 altogether. 7 on grief and 2 not on grief. as such, yeah. And on all different aspects of grief, like probably the first one, which is called Teenagers and Grief, that started my writing career, that just, I think, gave me the courage to write again. And I have to say, especially for your audience, I know nothing about writing. Like, I wasn't a writer, but I'm very good at spelling and grammar. So I knew how to put a sentence together. I knew how to structure content from my teaching experience. So I think I was very good at knowing how to put things in an order that made sense in a book. But I looked at things that were missing out there in the world of grief, and that's what I wrote about. So I wrote a book, for example, for parents, and I've called it What's Dead Mean? And it's how do you explain death to children? Because I knew that was missing. Probably my biggest bestseller was a book called Stuck for Words. What do you say to someone who's grieving? Because everyone asked me that question when they knew who I was and where I worked. Whether you're a funeral director or the lady down the road, everyone said, oh, I never know what to say to someone, you know, that I know that's had a death. Or I go to a funeral, I never know what to say when I approach the family. And I just thought, oh, there's a topic to write about. And I had a very good publisher here in Melbourne who loved the whole grief genre. And she said to me one day, what I like about your books is you write the way you speak. She said, people can read your stuff and get it. It's not fancy, it's not academic. It just tells it the way it is. And what I always did, and it was sort of like my signature, I always interviewed grieving people and put their snippets in, their stories, their quotes. And if you read anything that I've read, it always has real life experiences in it. And people remember stories and they love the stories. And I didn't have to make up the quotes. I got the quotes from real grieving people. And that to me just raised the level of the content in my books.
Yeah, I'm sure there's people watching that would be interested in finding some of your books. Where's the best place for them to get some?
Well, the sad news is my books they're all out of print, bar one little booklet I have that I just sell from my website. But you can get them all as ebooks through Amazon. And a lot of people have said to me, do you have audio books? I said, I just haven't had time to do that. That would be something I should do. But the book What's Dead Mean, I actually have a link on my website that you can just print it straight off there for free. And I find people are quite chuffed when they find, one, you get something for free, but two, that you can just, it's like an activity book for children, so you can just print that. But people have said to me, we've bought your books, but they'll usually buy them on Amazon, and there'll be older versions around that you can still buy, I think. But bookshops, I couldn't think of any that would still have one. They've been out of print for about 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is your website?
Website, it's All About Grief, so www.allaboutgrief.com. If you just Google my name, Doris Zagdanski, I'll appear, it will appear.
I'll pop it down in the description as well, because I'm sure there will be people that will want to learn more about you, for those that haven't seen your amazing work before. Doris, it's been an incredible career and journey that you've had. What does your work and your life look like these days?
Right, well, I tried to retire from full-time work about 5 years ago, and I found that every day was very long and boring, basically. And I always knew I would keep dabbling in education, and I had my website and I had my books and so forth. So I did just that. I kind of would just train in an organisation that would ring me and so forth. But about 2 years ago, the funeral company that I worked for asked me if I would come back and do some regular consulting work. And so I do a few hours a week for them, and I'm still mainly occupied in training funeral staff, supporting the funeral industry. I still do guest speaker things for organisations. I do in Queensland where I live. I train Queensland Police, one of my favourite groups of people to work with. So I still have regular clients, but I've just slowed it right down.
It's going to be hard for you to call it a day, isn't it?
Well, it is hard. I still do some celebrant work as well, but only for people I know. Yeah. I always say in my street, I've done nearly every funeral there is of the neighbours as such. I've done lots of family funerals and so forth. So if I'm asked, I tend to put my hand up and say, yes, I'll do that for you. And so that keeps you involved in the business. I don't see going forward that I would ever not be doing something. Yes, I just can't see that.
I, for one, am glad to hear that because, I mean, you've got so much to offer in a variety of different settings and different groups that you assist. Doris, I was thinking, given that this podcast is called The Other Side, and I'm hesitant to say this because I know you don't like your cliches, and because the other side kind of invokes this idea of passing to the other side. Take it as you will, but when you look towards the end of your career and you look back on all the things you've done, what's the one thing that you'd really like to be known for, the legacy that you want to leave behind?
I know the answer to that. I'd like to think I've made a difference. That's number one. And I've said that to my children. I said, on my headstone, just put my name and she made a difference. That'll do. Because I think without knowing it, when I was first asked if I would volunteer for the coroner and visit families, I was scared. Like, I'd never done anything like that before. But I also knew if it made a difference to that family, I had to put my big girl pants on and be brave enough to turn up. I'd be brave enough to learn how to support people. I did a lot of training and so forth to make sure I was doing the right things and saying the right things because I wanted to make a difference. As a funeral director, I often did things that were unseen when it came to funerals because I thought the family said they didn't want that. And so, well, what did they want? Well, it looked like that. Well, I'll make that happen. Well, that was making a difference. Yeah. I remember the first time I did a funeral in a home, a private family home. I thought, I hope we're allowed to. But the family asked if they could have the funeral at home. And so I said yes. And then I thought, maybe you can't. But I was going to make a difference. Yeah. And that to me is one thing that I hope is my legacy. And the other thing is sort of a broader message that I think my family knows, and that is I've travelled the road less travelled. And it started with Claire's death. I thought I'd just always be travelling the road of a mum that had 2 kids, was married, lived in suburbia, had a job, and everyone lived happily ever after. Well, that wasn't going to be my journey. And so I travelled the road less travelled when I took the job, I think, with the funeral company. I left teaching, which I'd always wanted to do, as I've told you. And I thought, no, I think this is the road I'm meant to be on. And in that, I went to different parts of the world training funeral directors, writing books. I didn't know how to write a book. I didn't know how you submitted anything to a publisher. I didn't know anything, but I knew I needed this book for these kids at this school. And I learned that I was quite fearless. And I didn't know I was, but after surviving Claire's death, I felt like I could survive anything. And so being on the road less travelled was not scary, it was just different. And if I could be brave enough to be different, I could survive that. And so I've always been on this road less travelled. I'm not interested what road someone else is travelling. If someone says, can you come and train at our organisation, or could I've written a book on dyslexia and ADHD. The road less travelled. Okay, I'll work that out. I'll work out how to do that. So I'm a bit fearless about life, I think.
Imagine telling 10-year-old Doris, who wanted nothing more than to be a teacher, that you would have had this journey.
I know.
What would she have said?
She would have said, I don't believe you, because I think, and people don't believe this, at school and even at uni, I was the quietest person in the classroom. I was not one to stand up the front and speak. I was very much brought up to speak when you're spoken to, quite strict mum and dad. So I'm quite shocked that I will stand in front of an audience and tell my story. And I tell it, as you know, Michael, I'll tell it warts and all. I'll say when it came to grief, I did everything wrong. When it came to Claire's funeral, I organised a funeral that was not helpful. I put my hand up and say, I didn't know what to say to a 3-year-old and so forth. So it's not always a good story, but it's a true story. And I own the truth of it. So I think the 10-year-old me would be quite shocked to see this quiet little girl who is not afraid to stand up and speak her story in the hope that others will learn or find an affinity with it. And people often say this to me, I thought I was crazy in doing what I did when I was grieving, and then I hear your story and I realise I'm just like everybody else. And I was like everybody else. Yeah.
Doris, I think your superpower is your authenticity, and I think that's why you're able to connect with so many people. And I'm just thinking, if the legacy you want to leave behind is that you've made a difference, you may as well kick your feet up now, because you have made such a difference in countless people. I think it's honestly hard to overstate the impact that you've had on thousands of lives, and myself personally. So I just want to thank you for everything that you've done and continue to do. You really are an inspiration.
Thank you, Michael. You're very generous. Thank you.
Was there any final thoughts before we bring this to a close?
I did just have a thought before, and this is for the audience. When I wrote my first book, the Teenagers in Grief book, I didn't tell anyone I was writing it because I was a bit embarrassed, because what if nobody wanted it? I didn't get it published and people just sort of laughed at me. But when I finally got a contract from the publisher, I told my mum, I said, guess what, Mum? I've been writing this book for a year on grief, and I think I said to her, I'm going to send it to a publisher or something. And she said, what if no one wants to read what you've written? Well, you know what? It had never dawned on me that would be the scenario. And I think it was an example of being fearless and travelling that road less travelled. And that's probably what I want to say to your audience. Just don't be afraid of, I used to be afraid of more like, what if someone didn't like it? What if I was rejected? What if someone said, why are you doing that? And when my mum said, what if no one would read it? Never entered my head that would be a scenario. And I'm glad I went into writing and my funeral career and my speaking career not doubting myself. Just not putting doubt ahead of the possibility of maybe someone would listen to me when I spoke.
And you know what else? Not only does it show your bravery and that you're fearless, and it also shows that your intentions are pure, because you're willing to go for it 100%, even if no one's reading. It shows that this is coming from the heart. This is not about achieving any sort of fame or money or anything. You're doing this because you believe it from the core of your being. So
totally.
Good on you.
And anything else is a bonus.
Yes, exactly. All right, Doris. Well, thank you so much for the chat today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure too, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.